Spotlight with Shadow, a Canadian dad who's got his finger on the pulse of global entertainment and sports. Each episode features unfiltered conversations with everyday creatives, musicians, wrestlers, filmmakers, and more from every corner of the globe. No fluff, just raw, real stories. This is Spotlight with Shadow, presented by Off the Top Media.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Spotlight with Shadow. Today, my guest does not need an introduction, but I'm going to give him one. He is arguably one of the busiest men on the continent. He is Danny Hotshot Duggan. How are you doing?
I am doing absolutely fantastic. I'm in a nice warm home in midst of a Canadian winter blizzard, so I'm happy to be where I'm at right now.
We just dealt with one not long ago, and I guess we're going to get the clipper from you in about a day, so not looking forward to that. We just got dumped on for 6 feet. Now it looks like another 2 is coming, so...
Yeah, it's a lovely time of year. We just wrapped up a 13-day tour in Western Canada, and we literally got hit with snow every single day of that 13-day loop. It didn't matter where in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta we were. As soon as we hit the road that morning, there was snow to follow. The joys of Canadian winter.
I don't miss the prairies at all for that reason.
Oh, it's terrible.
But it followed me here, so we're here. So I don't do a lot of pleasantries because I don't believe in that. But I want to ask you, tell me a little bit about young Danny growing up. Like, what got you inspired to become who you are today?
I guess ultimately, my dad would be to blame to that, as he is many of my life's problems. But it's, started at 3 years old. My dad put me in front of a television with professional wrestling on it. I don't think I've ever really watched much since. They called it an obsession. I called it a passion. And it was just something that I was hooked on ever since I could remember as a child. Like, my earliest memories as a human being on this planet is professional wrestling, and it's all I've ever loved. So I was a diehard fan to the fullest growing up as a child. And then, at the age of 12 years old, while I was watching wrestling at midnight on Channel 5, I was watching a WCW Saturday night rerun. There was a commercial for a local wrestling school in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And at 12 years old, I said, I want to be a pro wrestler. I'm going to call that number. So that's exactly what I did. I wrote that number down, waited until my parents were asleep, and I called that number. And the promoter answered and was kind enough, although realizing I was probably way too young to be making that phone call to make that inquiry, to kind of invite me down and help out at local wrestling shows. Not trained to be a wrestler yet, but come down, ring the bell, sell programs, set up chairs, carry pieces of the ring, things of that nature. And I kind of got a really early start being involved in local wrestling at the age of 12. Did that 12, 13, 14, trained to be a referee, was refereeing at 14, 15 years old while training to be a wrestler. And then, shortly before my 16th birthday, I debuted as a professional wrestler. And here I am almost 22 years later, maybe stupidly still doing this.
Hey, man, I was lucky enough to learn. I haven't been to a CWE show yet, and that's the promotion that you own and run like a madman, I hear. Good way. And I haven't made it out there yet because you don't come this far south typically. But I'm going to make it to one of these shows eventually because I've heard nothing but great things. I see the talent. I've interviewed one of your, I want to say, mainstays in Cam Makazi.
Yeah. Yeah, mainstay, one of my good friends. He's you don't have too many friends in the wrestling business, but he's been stuck with me for almost 20 years now. I love Cam.
That guy is full of stories, and I love it, and I love talking to him.
Yeah.
So you're growing up in a young age and you're in a young age paying your dues, if you will. Did you come across a lot of big names in those little indie promotions back then that would come down and do the shows?
Not really. Like in Winnipeg, and when I was 12 years old, that was like 1999. I started wrestling 2003. Like at the time, like big names were not coming through Winnipeg at all. Like you had the local wrestlers, and that was about it. Don Callis had a wrestling school in Winnipeg in 99. So he had like a small crew of students, but Don wasn't around too often. We had a lot of guys that were, popular wrestlers in the region from like the late 80s, early 90s that were around, but there wasn't a lot of big names here. And that was something I really realized really quickly when I got out as a teenager and started traveling across Canada and traveling to the Midwest US and across the US in general, is a lot of those regions had a lot of leftover stars who were big TV stars or regional stars that were still active in the territory and teaching the next generation of talent. We didn't have that here in Winnipeg. It was very, very rare. You'd get a guy from WWF television coming to town. So when I first started wrestling, like maybe once, maybe twice a year, Someone like Jim Neidhart or the Honky Tonk Man would come through for a special event. By the mid 2000s, it was a little more frequent. You were getting it 3-4 times a year. But by the time the late 2000s, early 2010s rolled around, then is when big name talent started to come through on a regular basis, and the independent scene really started to explode out here, and we started to kind of rub shoulders with those guys a little bit more.
So we'll talk about your promoting first, because I feel like the wrestler side is a longer questions and journeys. The promotion side of things, what is it like to say one day, just like I've asked this question to a couple of promoters now, do you just walk into a bank and go, here, I need this money, I'm going to start this wrestling promotion? Like, how did you get owning CWE?
I think like most young wrestlers or most young wrestling promoters, we start off with no money thinking wrestling's going to make us money. And then we learn very quickly that's not the case at all. No, it was 2009. I think I was 21, 22 years old when we started CWE. I'd been wrestling for about 6 years at that point. And I'd been very active, at 21, 22 years old. I pretty much covered the entire continent as a traveling pro wrestler. And there was a lot of really good talent here in Winnipeg, like incredible talent. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of them, over the course of this podcast, but a lot of really good guys. But you learn very quickly being a wrestler in Winnipeg, trying to make it, whatever that may mean internationally, get a TV job, whatever the case may be. You're geographically in the middle of nowhere and nobody gives a shit you're here. So it's really tough. So when I started traveling and getting to other territories and working with top guys, it really opened my eyes that there's a whole other world of pro wrestling out there and an incredible level of talent I've never worked with or been exposed to that really, humbled me to be a better wrestler. But it also told me we have some really good guys here in Winnipeg that no one's ever heard of, may never heard of, or may never hear of, that could make it, that just don't have the opportunity. So here in Winnipeg in 2009, the scene was pretty stagnant. There was a lot of local wrestling. There's like 8 or 9 local wrestling promotions at the time, or somewhere in that range. And it was very political. You wrestle here, or if you wrestle here, you don't wrestle there. So your work was very limited. You can only wrestle with certain groups of guys, but nobody that was, asking that of you was bringing in talent for you to work with to get you better or to network you out. So you're kind of just spinning the wheel. You're wrestling some good guys, but it was the same guys all the time in front of the same fans. And when I got the opportunity to start traveling out and seeing the level of talent that was out there, see the different level of promotion that was being done, the different styles of shows that were being operated, I said, nobody's doing anything like this in Winnipeg. And there's a lot of really good guys here that could really benefit from getting to work with top talent from other territories. So that's kind of what kind of kickstarted the vision of CWE. Is I was really, I felt complacent as a performer here. And I felt as long as I was wrestling in Winnipeg, it was just going to be another day on the schedule, but it was going to do nothing to advance me as a professional. So not only for myself, but for my peers, I wanted to create an environment where we'd be bringing in wrestlers from other territories, whether it be from across Canada, the US, import star talent, and give them the opportunity to not only work with guys of a higher level, but hopefully network with them and get out. So when you look at the first year of CWE, like our first ever show was headlined by, Bryan Danielson. Nigel McGuinness was the second show as Ring of Honor World Champion. The Briscoe brothers shortly after that. We had Austin Aries as World Champion in that year. Just a lot of real Tyler Black, Seth Rollins. Just a lot of really good top talent that were on the brink of becoming major stars. We were bringing them into Winnipeg for the first time ever when nobody had seen Ring of Honor or wrestlers like that, minus a few exceptions, and getting our guys in the ring with them to show, hey, guys, you can go with these guys. Now go up there and do it, make some contacts, and get the heck out of here. So that was kind of what, kickstarted CWE in 2009.
Wow. I didn't even know half of that. I know, like I said, I know I'm lagging. I'm sorry about that. I'm learning a little bit about CWE history just now as well. So you had those guys come down for you. Is it easy to sell Winnipeg for a destination for people to come to wrestle?
Truthfully, as a pro wrestler, if you're willing to pay somebody, they'll show up wherever you're willing to pay them to come up and wrestle. So that's an easy part of the business. But at the time, it was different. It's a lot easier for me now that I think I've ran over 800 live events over 16 years, and I've used hundreds of guys who have been on television. So now, getting somebody on the phone is fairly easy. I know everybody in the industry because I've either worked with them or I've worked with somebody who's friends with them. So that process is very simple at this point, 16 years in. In 2009, it wasn't the case. I was still a young wrestler, barely an adult, trying to put these things together. So I remember making deals with guys like Bryan Danielson and Nigel McGuinness and Seth Rollins on MySpace, with no media in between to say, hey, this is my buddy from Winnipeg. He runs a good company. I highly recommend him. It was all cold and getting these guys to come in. So in that sense, it wasn't difficult. It was just a matter of, putting together a deal that worked for both parties and making it happen. And luckily we're able to do that. Now fast forward 16 years later, it's a lot easier because we do have a good reputation. We've worked with so many incredible talents over the years that have glowing reviews and love coming to Canada that it makes it a lot easier for us to say, hey, we're interested in having you up too. Let's get it done.
You just had a man on your circuit who's arguably a lucha legend in Juventud Guerrera. How was that experience like? Have you worked with him before he is coming up to your event, or?
Yeah, this was the second time we had Juvi, actually. Juvi headlined the Juices on the Loose tour in 2019. We did a 32-day tour across the country right before the pandemic closed the country down. And that was our biggest tour in company history at the time. It spanned British Columbia through Toronto, and Juventud was a part of that. And I remember at the time, I had yet to work with Juvi. I'd worked with Psychosis, I've worked with Conan, I've worked with plenty of other Lucha Libre legends, but not Juventud. And when I announced Juvi, there were people that hey, he's got a bit of a reputation. You might want to be careful about that. And I'm so glad that I didn't listen and made up my own mind on that, because Juventud is an actual, absolute beauty of a human being. He was absolutely incredible on that 30-day tour. And we were just waiting for an opportunity to get him back up here, and the stars aligned to do that just recently. So he just came and did 2 tours with us. Of course, the tour of Ontario this past fall, and then he just wrapped up with us a couple weeks ago here in Central and Western Canada as well.
Yeah, I've been following that journey along on Instagram and stuff like that. It's been great to watch. It's been great to just watch in general, just the things you're doing. I do have to ask an awkward question, and I apologize. You don't have to answer this. When it comes to certain talents that have a history per se, and I'll use Marty Scurll as an example, would you bring someone like Marty Scurll into the promotion?
That's a good question. I would never say never. I've never personally met Marty. I personally have no issue with Marty, professionally or personally, because I have no relationship with him. But that's a tricky one. He's been here for other organizations here in Manitoba, and he's wrestled with a lot of my friends who have nothing but positive things to say about him, about their experience dealing with him as a promoter and wrestler, dealing with him as a wrestler to wrestler. But it's tough. It's one of those situations where you kind of have to, weigh both sides when it comes to him or any talent, because ultimately when you book an import talent to headline an event, the idea is to have them come in and be a benefit and bring positive attention to the company, hopefully bring in a new set of eyes and new fans. So if there isn't, a possibility, even if a small one is going to bring negativity and bring backlash to the show, you have to weigh that in as well. So I wouldn't say no. I wouldn't say a hard no. We would not work with him, but it is something I'd have to put into serious consideration, because whether it's warranted or not, and that's up for the individual to decide, there would be some consequence that would come with it. And there would be some people that would be, bringing their torches. And that's, something you don't necessarily want to be bringing, to the forefront when you're trying to promote a tour of positivity and draw people in at the, the highest quality.
Right. And the reason I brought that up is because I'm not naming any promotions. I mean, I just brought up one name, but there was a promotion recently here in Ontario that brought him in, and it caused a major backfire on them, and a lot of people were angry. So I was just curious, from a promoter standpoint, how do you feel about bringing in subjective talent, really?
It's really tough. If you want to call it cancel culture, whatever you want to call it, it's kind of muddied in a sense. There's a lot of pro wrestlers that are on television today and that are popular today and accepted today that have criminal backgrounds and have done some terrible things. But as a, near 38-year-old man myself now, there was a time in my life I wasn't a great human being, and I made a lot of bad decisions and probably left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths throughout my career as a professional or as a person that I'm not proud of, that I wish I could have taken back. So I don't think the individual should be shunned for their entire life or their entire career due to mistakes or bad things they did, within reason, obviously, because I think we're all human and we all do shitty things. And I think that's a part of the problem with the culture now. A lot of people pointing the finger. If you went through their phone or you went through their life history, they all said and did something shitty too, but they just didn't get caught in public doing it. So I think there needs to be some road to redemption. Like if somebody did something terrible, there needs to be some timeline, or there needs to be some show of good faith that this person has evolved and changed and is a better person and could be a good benefit to the show they're coming to. I don't think if you've done something terrible, your life should be over, your career should be over. You should never be able to make money again. Because there are people in the business that have been canceled that are shitty people, and it's probably rightfully deserved. But there are people that, made a bad decision, sometimes a really, really bad decision. And there should be consequence for it, but I believe there should be a road to redemption as well. So I think that's something that's never discussed enough. It's, hey, so-and-so did this once upon a time, whether that was yesterday, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, screw that guy forever. And personally, as a human being and as a professional, I don't know if that sits well with me. I think, we send criminals to prison and we try to reform them and make them better members of society. I think there should be something similar to that in professional wrestling and just in life in general. You shouldn't write somebody off forever because we all do shitty things. And if you say you haven't, you are a liar.
That is fair. I have to ask the hard question though, because you are a promoter first, right? So I have to ask. Now I want to ask another question, and this one is probably a little bit outlandish, but you get a call tomorrow. Brock Lesnar wants to come work in CWE. What are you saying?
I mean, where did he get this number from? We've done shows 5 minutes from his house and he hasn't showed up. So I'd be really surprised and think I was being ribbed. But of course, yeah, I don't see why not, right? Like, yes, there's accusations out there. They're still in court. They haven't been proven. That's one of those things, right? Like, I think that's right. A game time decision. You have to weigh the benefits of that. Is this going to bring more positive attention, negative attention? Is there legitimacy to the claims that are being made? And you have to kind of look in deep. I don't know if it's as easy as a yes or no answer. A lot of these things are subjective, and you kind of have to put some thought and some retrospective into it. Like as evil as Vince McMahon is, and probably truthfully so. I've been a fan of Vince McMahon, the character, my entire life. I think he's the best heel in the history of professional wrestling. But I'm certain every promoter, no matter how much they virtue signal or try to do the right thing, if they got a call tomorrow and said, someone said, hey, Vince would like to show up at your show on Friday night, they would think about it just a little bit, just a little. It wouldn't be a hard no from everybody. So I think it's, to the individual and the circumstance, and you kind of have to weigh all those options.
Fair enough. Before we get into your wrestling journey, I want to ask some personal questions. By all means, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, of course. Given that you're a promoter and a full-time wrestler, is it stressful in the family life when it comes to it?
No, I'm very lucky. I've got a really supportive family, with what I do. And, I have a daughter that's almost 6. And my wife and daughter are very much a part of CWE just as much as I am. They're on the road with me, going to towns day to day. They're running the door. They're running the concession, the merchandise. My daughter at 5 years old, they're running the lights for the entrance, the smoke machines, all those things. So, I'm very lucky to have them along for the ride. So I'm very blessed that way.
That's awesome. That's awesome to hear, right? You get a lot of guys who it becomes their life, especially when it's on the road a lot. And I'm glad to hear that you're a family first man. That's a great attribute to have, especially in today's world.
I call it small blessing.
I can imagine it's crazy though at times when you're driving through the storms and stuff together.
Yeah, having a daughter is she's the reason for the first time ever in my career that I pulled over and got a hotel before actually making the town 3 hours before. It's like, this storm is too much. If it was just me, we're going to power through. We're going to get there. We're going to get to that town. But, when you have your family in the car, it's a little bit of a different story, and you have a different lens on it. But you talk about small blessings, like prior to my daughter being born, I was very lucky to be getting a lot of major opportunities. I was getting WWE tryouts. I was going down to the Performance Center. I was regularly booked for extra work and things of that nature when they'd come through the area. So in my mind, I was this close, I was knocking at the door, then the pandemic happened. And then during the pandemic, I had a serious injury, and, time passes you by very quickly, especially when you're in your 30s. So you sit back and sometimes think like, what could have been, what if the world didn't shut down? What if I didn't get hurt? What if is, I've got to spend 5-6 years with my family on the road, where if those things didn't happen, I would have been on the road grinding it out, doing 150 plus shows a year, trying to get my foot in the door with a major company or somewhere internationally, which would have took me away from home and away from that family. So I think the world works out the way it's supposed to.
I mean, you're from an area that I'm glad to get out of most times when I go through Canada. So kudos to you for even doing that. But I didn't grow up in a better spot either. So I mean, it is what it is.
I grew up in the north end of Winnipeg.
All right,
That's pretty much
let's talk about your. Yeah, no, we don't talk about that too much. So you started wrestling at the age of 14.
15.
You were trained by Tomahawk Gene Swan and Hotshot Johnny Devine. What was that experience like coming up?
It was good. Like I said, I was reffing at the age of 14, 15. And at the time I was training under various amounts of guys for a group called River City Wrestling here in Winnipeg. They were a long-standing group, dating back to 93 that operated for about 15, 20 years. And while I was refereeing, I was training before the shows with whoever the booker or trainer was at the time. It was always a revolving door. So I kind of got my start and had my first match definitely well before I was ready. And that was kind of the first 3 months of my career, just training under whoever was available to get in the ring and work with me before shows. So somebody didn't show up. I ended up getting called up from reffing to wrestling a match on that show and was kind of off and running, but I wasn't quite equipped to do the job yet. And, you talk about just weird timing and luck, if you want to call it that, and things kind of just working out the way they're supposed to. About 3-4 months into wrestling for River City Wrestling, just shortly after my 16th birthday, there was a huge change in the insurance industry, and you could not get the proper insurance to run Winnipeg community clubs anymore, which is where all the shows in Winnipeg would happen for all ages events. So I was no longer able to wrestle because there was no all ages shows. You had to be 18 and wrestle in a bar. So that kind of like snuffed me out pretty quick. And, luckily, there was a group called the CWF. It still exists. It's out of Ontario now, but it used to be based in Winnipeg under a man by the name of Ernie Todd. And he was running a touring company that would go across Canada doing the reservations. So he gave me an opportunity with his company. And he said, if you want to do this, there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of work here, but you got to finish your training and kind of get caught up. And Gene Swan was his head trainer at the time. And Gene Swan was incredible. I still credit him to this day and stay in touch with him to this day, as he taught me the fundamentals of pro wrestling I wasn't being taught properly during my first tenure with River City Wrestling. So Gene taught, the bells and whistles, the meat and potatoes of professional wrestling. And then I was off and running for a couple of years. And then during my time in 2005, wrestling for a company called Action Wrestling Entertainment here out of Winnipeg, Johnny Devine, who some might be familiar with from his time in Ontario, but also TNA Wrestling, he had to return home to Winnipeg for a surgery he needed, and he became the head trainer of the AWE Wrestling School. So I kind of got to do my finishing class, or my university class, so to speak, with Johnny Devine, who was very influential in teaching me how to put all those moves I learned, put them together mentally, and kind of start putting the package together that would become Danny Duggan over the next 20 years.
So without exposing your actual self, where do you come up with the, and again, if you don't want to speak, you don't have to speak on it, because again, I like to keep kayfabe as long as you're wanting to. But where do you gather Danny Duggan from? Like, where is it in a place you go in your head? Is it just something that you've aspired over the years? Is it where does the creativity come from?
The name itself or the character?
The character.
Man, that's just been an evolution over the years. So the name itself kind of just came from, I was refereeing, and the local promoter needed a name as I was coming to the ring to referee as a young teenager. And that was the name he gave me. And it just kind of stuck. I started wrestling. That was the name I was refereeing under. So we just rolled with it and kept on going. And then you want to talk about the transition of where it was to where I am now. It's kind of seen many phases over the years as I, close in on 22 years as a wrestler. initially just trying to find yourself. You're trying to be who you think is cool or what you saw on TV and you think is going to resonate. But the first real distinct Danny Duggan character, if you want to call it that, was really, a tribute, if you want to call it that, and it's probably putting it nicely, but more so a ripoff of Kenny Omega, who was a wrestler here in Winnipeg as well, as many know. He's from Winnipeg. And I really looked up to Kenny. Like he was the man. He was someone who was very kind to me when I was a young teenager, because he grew up in the business as a teenager as well. And, kind of took me under his wing in some aspects. And he's somebody I really aspired to be like, not only as a human being, but as a professional. He was, you could tell even early on, this guy's something. And I always kind of gravitated towards that and kind of wanted to be like Kenny, right down to trying to wrestle like Kenny, and nobody can do that. And that's something I learned and figured out very quickly. And that's where the
bout machine out there, Kenny Omega.
Yeah. So that's part of the progression of Danny Duggan, is trying to be Kenny Omega, learning you can't be Kenny Omega because nobody can. He's one of a kind. Sorry. So that was kind of my first, 2005, 2006. I had kind of the same surfer look he did. I had the long blonde hair, the shell necklace. We were a tag team for a while. So I was trying to be, I was little Kenny. You look at pictures of us from the time, like I was like Kenny's little brother, and that's kind of what I was aspiring to be. I wanted to be like Kenny. But then over time that kind of shifted and grew and evolved. And, by the time the mid 2000s rolled around, pro wrestling, especially on the independent circuit, took such a hard turn to be more progressive, in the sense it's more, high speed, high velocity, high impact, kind of more so the style that's more prevalent today. But me being an old school wrestling fan, always had my roots in traditional pro wrestling. And that was very noticeable at the time, because everybody was going one direction. And I said, no, this is what pro wrestling is. So I kind of became more of a throwback to pro wrestling. And then I started to embrace that. I was, long before it became trendy and cool again, I brought back Zubaz pants and sold thousands of pairs of them across the continent before everybody else started wearing them again, and brought back the fanny pack and things of that nature. And it was kind of like, the retro rocker. I was kind of a throwback to old school pro wrestling and a lot of those tropes that are now kind of cliche now. But I was kind of doing that before everybody else was, because I kind of put my flag in the sand and I said, pro wrestling may be evolving, but this is what pro wrestling is. So that was kind of my next step along my journey. And then somewhere along the way, I think it was kind of like the mid 2015, 16, 17. My character was kind of evolving. I was still young, but I was growing into a man. And just story-wise, I needed to toughen up a little bit with what we were doing here in Winnipeg. It'd be a little more grizzled. So the beard was coming in, the chest hair was coming in. And, everybody started saying, you know what, you not only work but you look a lot like Arn Anderson. So I kind of started leaning into that for a couple of years, even to the point when I did, a WWE dark match, they called me Martin Lundy Jr., which is his shoot name, because I had resembled Arn so much. So I kind of leaned into that for a while. And then, in recent years, for those that are, following CWE or brand new, if you looked at me now, you'd go, well, this guy's Canadian. Why is he decked out in USA? During the pandemic, things got pretty hostile up here, just in culture, in society, things of that nature. And I was one of the first people to be very vocal and put my hand up and go, hey, I don't agree with this. Mostly because, I had a young family and I was being told by the Canadian government I couldn't work for 2 years. So here I am trying to feed my family without an opportunity to do so, because we couldn't operate live events anywhere in the country. So during that process, I relocated to the United States of America. And while doing that, it was kind of right around the time my character was evolving and going to be making a change anyways. It never got to where it was originally intended, but it was time for it to make a change. I'd been the flag bearing, top Canadian babyface for CWE for a long time. But it was time for somebody else to kind of take that mountain. So here I was, contemplating, where do I go next with that? What's the next evolution of the Danny Duggan character? And luckily it came very easy. I had to move to the US. I was living down there for 6 months at the time. And then things opened up here in Canada to come back and start doing live events again. So here was somebody who was very vocal about his dislike for the Canadian government and how they had handled things during those 2 years. So it kind of became like reality became what pro wrestling was for me at the time. And I became a far right American patriot, if you want to say it, because, as I looked at the culture online and the way people were interacting and what people were being responsive to and triggered by, I said, I know exactly where this needs to go, and kind of came back waving the American flag and being proud of America and how they handled the situation and how they respect freedom and they respect your rights and things of that nature. And it's kind of taken on a life of its own. And in 22 years, I'm probably having more fun than I've ever had in my entire career with this new presentation and this interaction with the audience.
Did you at least live somewhere warm?
Sadly, no. The majority of my time was spent in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I initially ended up in Arizona, but it wasn't meant to be to stay there long term. So I ended up in Green Bay. But in all fairness, they had a very warm winter compared to what I'm used to in Manitoba. So it was pretty much like the tropics.
When I tell people, because again, like I alluded to before with you, I grew up in the prairies. And when I tell people that it can hit -70, they look at me like I'm crazy. But it's a completely different cold to the east.
I call it FU weather. It's so cold that you'll walk outside. You could be bundled up. You could have your mittens, your toque, your scarf on. You could be ready to go. But the second you walk out, it's so cold and it hits your bones and just your immediate organic response of just like, F you, like it just drives it out of you because it's so cold and it's so miserable and there's no way to avoid it. That's just life. And that's life for 5 months of the year.
Yeah, sometimes 7, depending on how much of a winter we actually get.
You're right, 100% right.
So you had said you worked with Mr. Kenny Omega. When a lot of people consider wrestling in the Western Canada, to a lot of the Americans and Eastern Canadians, when we talk about Western Canada and we talk about wrestlers that have come out, the majority of the people go, "Oh, Bret Hart, Owen Hart, the dynasty of the Harts." And then there would be people like, "Oh, well, Chris Jericho." But the biggest name, in my opinion, to come out of Canada, this is my personal opinion, is Kenny Omega and Owen Hart. Those are my two biggest names when I think of Canadian wrestling.
Well, when you want to talk about this generation, it's Kenny Omega hands down from Central or Western Canada. Like being a Winnipeg boy, Chris Jericho was always my guy. He was my inspiration. Like if Chris Jericho can make it from St. James, Winnipeg, I can make it too. So that was kind of always my inspiration. There was a guy on WWF or WCW TV from Winnipeg, so I can do this too. Like Roddy Piper's from Winnipeg, technically Saskatoon, grew up in Winnipeg. Don Callis, but he had a very short run in the 90s that really wasn't profiled as being from Winnipeg. So Jericho was like always the guy and kind of the only guy that was viewed on the world stage as a Winnipeg wrestler. And he broke into the national scene 95, 96. So there was a long lull between that, but there was nobody from Winnipeg making it. Then Kenny finally kind of broke that mold and he did it on his own terms. You talk about the Harts and things of that nature. And of course, they're the Mount Rushmore of Canadian wrestling. But that was a different era and they came with the Stampede territory to WWF when they were taking over. Kenny's like the only real guy I can think of that really has made it from this generation. There's a lot of guys from Alberta that made it, but a lot of them were from the 90s and that era. There's nobody else. There's nobody else that has really reached the peak or anywhere near it that Kenny has from Central or Western Canada in the last 20 years. There's obviously some in Eastern Canada. You got some guys from Toronto or you got Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn from Montreal, but for this side of the country, it's Kenny.
Yeah, I agree. Like you look at our Central to Eastern Canada and the 4 names that really come to your mind are Adam Copeland, Christian, Jason, I can't remember his last name, which is Christian, Kevin Steen, and Sammy. Really, those are the biggest names to come out of this side of the country.
And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like just being in Canada, especially now. It was a little bit different then in the 90s. There's still a little bit of a foot on the ground here to keep an eye on guys. But like that goes to show, like you just listed off 4 or 5 guys in a country, how big with how many wrestlers that have made it on the world stage. And there's a lot. I'm not saying they're as good, arguably some, you might be able to make the argument for, but there's a lot of guys that are on that level or could have been on that level if they were given that opportunity from various parts of Ontario, Central Canada, Western Canada, that just didn't get the right break or get seen by the right guy to be on that level. So that really speaks volumes of how talented those guys were, because they were able to break through that completely and ascend to superstardom. But that's the crazy thing about Canadian wrestling. It's really geographically in the middle of nowhere in terms of the wrestling world, because there's a lot of guys that are really good like that could have been big stars too if they were seen by the right people and just given the right opportunity.
You said the right words there, and I got to bring up a couple names. You have Jinder Mahal, Santino Marella, the Bollywood Boys. There's one more I'm forgetting in there, but like, there's guys that are been seen by the right people. Oh, Eric Young. Guys that have been seen that made it up, but then were underutilized, and they have the talent. So for guys like you, who's a promoter, when you see
guys don't, that's a lot, thing about pro wrestling, a lot of fans sometimes don't realize either. You'll see, oh, this guy wasn't used, or this guy deserves an opportunity. There's a lot of really good wrestlers out there, on every single level. And that's the wild thing about pro wrestling. To be successful in the NFL, if you're a quarterback, you have to be able to score touchdowns. And if you can score touchdowns, there's going to be a job for you. That's not always the case in pro wrestling. You can be the very best in your area or the very best at what you do. If you don't have the right people at the right time pushing for you, you could be spinning your wheels forever. And there's so many guys, not only in Canada, but just across North America, I stepped in a ring with, and I'm like, wow, this guy's on another level. He's so good, that just never made it to television. It's astounding. Like, pro wrestling is a very weird anomaly like that, where it's like, it's all the stars have to align. And, just being talented isn't enough. It's definitely necessary. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you could have very little to none, and they'll take a chance on you and they'll mold you to what they need you to be. I worked with a lot of those guys too, but just being incredibly talented doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a success and you're going to make a lot of money. And that's like the crazy thing about pro wrestling. And I think that's part of the addiction and the drive as a performer. It's like playing the lottery. Every day you go out there and you try to, move forward in the business, because it's just like, it can happen to anybody at any time, especially if you're playing your cards right.
Right. And you being a promoter, when you see guys like that are homegrown talent, when you see them getting released and stuff, do you like start to like, okay, I got to call these guys in about 60 days to make sure I can book them, or where does that go for you?
In this day and age, you usually wait about 6 months, because if they're coming off of television 60 dads after, that rate's right through the roof. So you got to let that cool off a little bit first, and then you can get on the phone with them and negotiate.
But you had said, like, there's a lot of guys, and I'm doing this kind of stuff, and this is my way into the business, and I'm learning a lot, and I'm going about it, and I think the right way, and that's going through the indies up, because I want to pay my dues going up. You know what I mean? Like, I want to spotlight who I can. I want to put it in the hands that I can, and stuff like that. But I get, I have these arguments with people all the time, and I see it more of a logical sense where, and I know this word is thrown around a lot in professional wrestling, where you have the smart marks who think they know everything and they can divulge and tell you how to book a show. But then there's me, who sits there, in my opinion, it's biased, obviously. I look at it logically. You have stuff happening on TV right now, and the Wyatt Six, for instance, they're being buried. They're not. They're the long-term story being told, and you just don't have the patience now. Now, on the indie scene, do you have the storyline issues with your fans and crowds, like at home base, where they get bored of it quickly, or they're trying to like predict what's happening?
Not really. We're really lucky. Like, Winnipeg's a good wrestling town, so that we've got a really supportive, loyal audience from show to show that's out here to support what we're doing. Truthfully, like, our business model with CWE is a lot different than what it used to be. When we started running CWE, we were a monthly Winnipeg indie, so you'd have your angles that would progress month to month, and your stories would eventually wrap up with a pinnacle, and somewhere along the way we had local cable access TV, and then you try to put those angles together on TV week to week, and then eventually have a payoff at the live event. In our current form, I don't know if we mentioned this before we went on air or after, we run something around 120 live events a year now, so we've kind of changed our business model in the sense that we're kind of a touring spot show now. There's definitely characters we get you familiar with. We want you to love them. We want you to hate them. We definitely give you a sprinkle sprinkle of conflict between those characters. So if you are coming from tour to tour, you're going to see it. But the reality is we're coming every 3 to 4 months now to a lot of these markets. So if you're getting too detailed in your angles and your story with what you're doing, chances are people aren't going to remember it, or there's a good chance there's going to be a big portion of the audience that wasn't there 3 months ago. They might not have been there, for 6 months, since their last show. So you try to make it, you try to book your show with characters that they're familiar with, conflict that they understand, but also conflict that can be told and sometimes resolved all in the same night to give people that experience. They go, wow, that was a great night of pro wrestling. I can't wait till they come back and we can do it all over again. But when it comes to, smart fans, if you want to call them that, I think everybody is a smart fan to an extent. I was 10 years old predicting the finishes of pay-per-views. The cool thing about pro wrestling is, how do I articulate this? I'll often say there's no wrong way to do something, but there definitely is. There's definitely wrong ways to do things, and you learn that very quickly, especially when you're getting wrestlers' input on their angles. But for the most part, wrestling is very subjective, and I think that's the really cool thing about pro wrestling. Like if I were to have a match right now, me and you, Shadow, Hotshot, Danny Duggan, were to have a match right now, we'd go out there and tell a story that we came up with that day, and we'd execute it to the best of our abilities, to the best reaction we can gain. And then if we came back through the curtain and sat down and talked to 10 different wrestlers of either the same experience level or varying experience levels, they'd all give us 10 completely different, amounts of feedback and advice and what they would have done different or what they've liked. Like pro wrestling is very subjective, that it can go so many different ways, and there's so many different ways you can do things or not do things. Ultimately, it's got to entertain the audience as a whole. And if it's doing that and people are enjoying it and they're continuing to come back and watch it week after week or month after month or tour after tour, then you're doing it right. If you're doing it and you see those audiences continuing to dwindle and get smaller and smaller, or you're going out there and you're trying to execute it and that crowd is completely silent and they don't give a shit what you're doing, then you have to reevaluate, but more times than not, sometimes you just got to buckle up and enjoy the ride, because there is, not always, quote unquote, a right way to do it, because your right way may be different than my way. What you want to see in a pro wrestling match is different than what I want to see, and vice versa for everybody else in the audience. So you always got to try to cater to everybody and make sure the ultimate experience is enjoyed by the general population.
Hey, that's kind of the answer I was hoping to get, and you articulated that perfectly. I do want to apologize that I am not on camera. My connection's a little bit more stable with the camera off because it's not feeding my computer so much. But I want to talk about your 3 stints that I see here for Ring of Honor. You did it 2010, 2015, and 2016. Arguably, the biggest name that pops up to me that you had a match with was Mark Briscoe.
Yeah, I was very lucky.
What was that like?
It was great. I think I've done. I'd have to look. I'm just off the top of my head. I think I did 7 or 8 matches for Ring of Honor over those 3 stints. The first one, going back to Kenny Omega, he was the guy to get my foot in the door. 2010, he just got into the company and he was making waves and doing really well for himself. And he was kind enough to get me an opportunity with the company then. So that was my first opportunity with the company. My second opportunity, which was, I think, 2012, you mentioned. Talk about this. This
10,
goes back
15
to
and 16.
Yeah. So I think there's also one in 2012. So you want to talk about timing, not to say it would have been any different any other way, but what ifs in pro wrestling. So, was it 2000? It might've been 2010. So Adam Pearce came in as NWA World Champion to CWE and another organization here in Winnipeg. And he was the head booker for Ring of Honor at the time. And he did a seminar with certain participants being selected for a future opportunity in Ring of Honor. And I was one of those people chosen, as was Kamikaze. He was chosen as well. So we went to Toronto. I'm trying to think if that's the same one. I believe it was the same one. I might be getting stories backwards here, but I'm pretty sure this is the case. But Adam Pearce got me another. He personally chose me to go and do a match for Ring of Honor in Toronto. This would be my second time there. And I remember it clear as day. We were on tour. Yeah, it was August 2010 because we were on tour. Jimmy Jacobs was there, Roderick Strong, Hurricane Helms. Yeah, we're in the middle of Saskatchewan, maybe Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, for some reason rings a bell. And then the news broke that Adam Pearce had been let go as booker of Ring of Honor. And this was like maybe a month maybe a month and a half out until I was supposed to go back there and get another tryout or opportunity. So here I am, like, as a young kid going, oh no, like, your first instinct is selfish, going, oh, my dreams, my hopes and dreams. And you're like, oh shit, Adam lost the job too. So it's a double-edged sword of sucking, but to Adam's credit, being a professional and true to his word, he had been released, and I imagine it being a frustrating time losing a high-level position like that, having to decide what's next in his career for himself, reached out to me as a lowly indie guy who had no skin in the game or any pull in his career moving forward, and said, hey, man, just a heads up, I'm no longer with the company, but I will make sure you still get your match, which I thought was a super solid thing of him to do. And I got to work with Adam many times over the years following that for other organizations, but just a true man and word of, he had character and came through on that when he could have just said, hey man, sorry, I lost my job. Too bad. But he saw it through and he still got me the match. And I went to Toronto and I got to work, but it was right when Delirious took over as booker. So he was just coming in. He was brand new. He was taking over an entire company. And when someone's taking over an entire company, they've got a million things on their mind. And the guy doing the dark match in Toronto is not one of them. So he's getting his own guys into the mix and he's got his own vision and things of that nature, so I kind of understood that going in. That was the last one for a little while. And then a couple of years later, realizing that, hey, if I want to get on with this company and get an opportunity to move forward in the business, I'm going to have to get in front of Delirious and build a relationship with him the same way I built with Adam. So I went down and did, I think it was a joint camp in Philadelphia. It was Ring of Honor and New Japan. And, I thought I had a really strong camp and, opened some eyes and made some new connections with Delirious and guys like Kevin Kelly, who to this day was, I give a lot of credit for, really helped me with my promos, just that one weekend alone that I was able to carry on and use forward, to a benefit to my character now 8-9 years later. So that kind of opened the door and I started to get more opportunities with Ring of Honor in the years to follow, especially when they were in the Midwest. So I remember the first one I got a call and I think I did a dark match with Eric Cannon in Minneapolis. And Eric, I owe a huge thank you to this day, because I remember going down and doing that first match with Eric. We had like a week-long tour in Manitoba leading up to that Ring of Honor show. I think I even had a CWE show the same day as that Ring of Honor show that I couldn't be at because I had the Ring of Honor opportunity. But I had to drive overnight on no sleep to get to Minnesota from Manitoba and show up and do the match after being up for 2 days, having driven myself there. And Eric, being the pro he was, he carried me through it like a champion. And we had a really good match that luckily led to more opportunity. And when they were back in Minneapolis again, I got the email and they said, this time you're going to be on the main card with Mark Briscoe, which blew my mind because, he's, obviously one of the pillars of Ring of Honor. So to get an opportunity to be in the ring with Mark Briscoe, who luckily I had known because he had been up to CWE years prior for me here in Winnipeg, which, definitely probably helped my experience when I got to work with him. But it was super exciting. And I've said this in previous interviews. Mark was the pro everybody he says he is. He's just such a good human being and a great professional. Here I am, literally, in Minnesota, I was a top guy. I'd been working on top and a champion for many companies for multiple independents in Minnesota at that time. But in terms of Ring of Honor, I'm nobody. And here I am with Mark Briscoe, multi-time Ring of Honor world champion at that point, established as a legend in that company, working with me in the opening match. And if you ever get the opportunity to watch that match, he gave me a lot. We had a really good match, one that I was really, really proud of, to the point where we're putting it together and I'm saying to Mark, are you sure? Is this going to be okay? I feel like I'm getting a little too much here to be, in the ring with someone of your stature where I am and for to be this competitive. And then he'd come back and give me even more, so he was incredibly humble. Just a great human being to work with. And I thought we had a really, really good match. And that, set the bar for me to get more opportunities with Ring of Honor when they came to the Midwest. And then the pandemic happened, the company sold, and that was the end of that story.
That is crazy. Just the journey there, working with Mark Briscoe, arguably one of the most, I like to think of until he decided to go to AEW. But the Briscoe brothers were arguably the biggest talents to not ever sign to a big promotion.
Yeah, it's crazy. They're so good. And this is what I like. This kind of goes back to what we're talking about, like people being canceled and there being no road to redemption. If I understand correctly, and I could be off base, it's been a while since I paid any attention to it. Like they were kept off of AEW TV and their WWE deals canceled, because of a shitty tweet that Jay put out. That I'm sure, he was legit, knowing him, in the time I got to professionally, he was probably legitimately remorseful about. He was such a good-hearted human being, so he said, and he said a terrible thing. I don't think it was intended to be hurtful. It was in bad taste, most definitely. And then it ended up costing them what probably could have been, multi-million-dollar careers because they were generational talents. But with that being said, like that was 2013 or something like that was put out, and there was no road to redemption. It was like, you said this terrible thing then, there's no coming back from it. And that's so heartbreaking to see, especially when you have good humans like they are, who, realize they made mistakes, I believe to have grown as human beings and become better for it. And were so respected by anybody that worked with them. Like I've never met a human in this business that has ever spoken poorly about their experiences with Mark or Jay Briscoe, always positive. So to see something like that, from that long ago, just be an X on you that you can never overcome or come back from is heartbreaking to see. And I really hope things like that change. Not to say guys can't be held accountable or there shouldn't be consequence. But once again, there needs to be some room for reason, because that's truly a heartbreaking story of what could have been, because those guys were truly, probably the best tag team of this generation.
Yeah, they're like you said, they're generational talents, and it's hard and few between to find them. As much as that gets thrown around a lot, generational talent. I mean, you being in Canada, you understand this, especially when it comes to our hockey teams. We hear generational talent here, generational talent there. It's so overplayed now, and I'm assuming it's the same in professional wrestling.
Yeah, to a certain degree. Like there's, I've been in the ring with literally the who's who of pro wrestling over my 22 years, in the business. And there's certain guys you get in the ring with, Kenny Omega being one of them, where you're like, oh, wow, I'm nowhere near as good as I thought I was. There's other levels to this. There's a lot of guys that are really, really, really good, but then there's certain talents like that. You get in the ring with them and you go, oh, wow, okay, I had no idea. Guys can be this good. So that does happen, most definitely.
So with that being said, there, I got to ask, and you don't have to name if you don't want to, because I understand the business a bit on that. But who is the shittiest wrestler you've wrestled over your 22 years that you can arguably call out and be like, "Yep, that guy, fuck him."
Could we do a quick break, and I'll give you 20 seconds?
Yes, sir.
I'll land. All right. So the shittiest wrestler I've ever been in the ring with. I wouldn't be staying true to my form if I didn't say the headline Sean Martins, because that's what I tell him each and every time we share a locker room. But it's truthfully not him, as much as I would like to give him credit and put all the blame on him. He's not the worst guy I've been in the ring with. Just one of them. I kid, Sean. I love you. The worst guy I've been in the ring with. Wow. I've been in the ring with a lot of really, really bad wrestlers. And I mean that respectfully, and I mean that with love. When I've been, doing this as long as I have and travel as many places, you're going to come across some stinkers along the way. I can't think of anyone that was too atrocious where it was like completely uncontainable. You get a lot of guys that aren't trained properly along the way, but the more you do this and the more capable you are, you learn how to kind of navigate those and keep yourself safe and get the most out of the least. So there's not too many situations where I can say like this guy's the worst. I remember like really early on doing a tour of New England. I don't remember the guy's name, and I'm sure he's better now. And I'm sure, he was early in his career, and I was just young and full of piss and vinegar. Like I remember wrestling a guy, I think it was like in Maine or Boston or something like that. And he said he was trained by the Chaotic Wrestling School. And, that was a badge of honor in that area. If you were trained by Chaotic, you're one of the top guys. But I remember like locking up with this guy, and just everything he put me in was a shoot. Like he put me in a wrist lock, and he was legitimately putting me in a wrist lock, put me in a hammer lock. He's putting me in a legitimate hammer lock, to the point I'm getting hot. Like I think we ended up getting into like a semi shoot in the ring. So I'm like, if you want to shoot, let's shoot. So we got through the match. It wasn't very good. And when I got to the back, I said something. I paraphrasing. This was 20 years ago. Like I remember saying something like, "Who trained you?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm trained by Chaotic, and that's just we work." I think he said he's like, "Oh, I'm trained by Low Key, and that's just the way we're trained, brother. We train to work stiff." And I was like, "Well, if Low Key trained you, you should probably get your money back because you're the shits." It was something like that. It was completely unnecessary and something I would never do now in my older age. But I remember just being in the ring with this guy and just being frustrated because there's one thing to work, quote unquote stiff. I'm a Canadian wrestler. We're trained to wrestle snug. At least my generation is. It's, hit hard in safe places. I will never complain about that because I'm the first guy to do it. But the fans don't know the difference between when you're really applying a wrist lock on me and when you're not and doing it properly to make it look like you are. So there was just like a lot of things that were putting me in danger and potentially hurting me. That was incredibly frustrating, where it just kind of like boiled over. I think my car had broken down on that trip as well. And, I was stuck in the States for an extra week and a half. So there's probably a whole lot of other frustration that came into play with that story for the big blow up at the end. That's like the only time. I remember there's a few instances where I've, blown up, with guys, but mostly when I was younger and immature and didn't know how to handle it. It's very, very rare now. I get in the ring with somebody, go, wow, this guy's, really bad. Let's fight about it. I don't think that happens at all. Definitely get in the ring with guys now and go, oh, he's bad. But now being older and mature and, confident in my own abilities, not only to handle myself, but how to, control someone like that in the ring, it's usually fine. For the most part, I actually enjoy it. There'll be times where guys will look at me as the booker and go, why are you booking yourself with him? I'm like, yeah, just to see if I can do it. I don't mind the challenge of trying to get something out of nothing, as long as it's done safely, of course.
Right. I mean, I was going to ask the alternative question, and it might not be the answer I think it is, but the alternative to that is who's the best. And I want to say it would be Kenny at this point, but I'm sure you might have a different opinion.
That's really so subjective. There's so many guys that are so good at so many different things. Kenny's on that list. The one I haven't wrestled Kenny in 15 years now. So like it'd be like wrestling him now would be completely different than anything I ever remembered. The reason I remember so fondly wrestling with Kenny as my tag partner and as my opponent, the times I did early in my career, is he was so confident in his ability, so young, and I was so insecure and still trying to figure out who I was and how to wrestle and how I wanted to wrestle. He always made me step outside my box and do things I was uncomfortable with and assured me I'd be okay. And I always was. So Kenny gave me a lot of confidence, and I knew I was always in good hands with him. If I wasn't okay, he had it. So he was definitely one of the best at that time, but I haven't wrestled him in the years he was, headlining the Tokyo Dome or Ring of Honor or AEW. So I can only imagine what it's like now. It's got to be on a completely different tier. But even then in his early years, like you knew this guy was somebody. Other guys that really stand out that I really enjoyed wrestling that I thought were just in a league of their own. Michael Elgin was one. I know he's not always a popular name to say these days, but he's one of the best pro wrestlers I've ever been in the ring with. He's another guy that made you work hard, sometimes harder than you had to and didn't need to. But I think that was a part of what made him so good is he didn't have an off switch. I remember being in small town, northern Manitoba, wrestling in front of 20 people with him going, why in the world are we taking these crazy big bumps when we don't have to? But that was his mode. He just had to go. And, it toughened you up. It made you work and realize, hey, those people bought a ticket too. We're giving them a show tonight. He was another guy who doesn't get enough credit for being as good as he is the crown jewel Chase Owens. He's prominently in New Japan, but he's done some stuff. He's American, so obviously he's done a lot of stuff in the States as well. But he was just another guy. He was trained by Ricky Morton, and I loved wrestling Chase as a babyface because in a day and age where everybody calls 1,000 spots that you have to remember. You can get in the ring with Chase and wrestle for 30 minutes, and I wouldn't have to say a word. I would just have to keep my ears open and know my job as a babyface. He would always get me over. He would always get his heat, and we'd have a great match every single night. I love wrestling Chase Owens, and I miss you, Chase Owens. Come back to Canada. He's another guy. Who are some other guys? Jason Kincaid, if you're not familiar with, look him up. Jason the Gift Kincaid. He was a guy that was really, I'm shocked to this day he never landed a TV contract because he was really, it was 8-9 years ago when he first started coming up to CWE to do tours. He's from West Virginia. He would come up with Chase Owens and Sigmund and the Southern Boys. And he was such a unique talent. So versatile. He could, wrestle a modern progressive style, a Southern style of pro wrestling, whatever you wanted. He could do it to the highest level. And he was the most innovative man I was ever in a ring with. He was one of those guys that I would share a ring with and go, oh, wow, he's on another level than I am. And, he's such a nice guy. That's probably why he doesn't have that's probably why he never got to that, next level, because he definitely had the talent, especially with the business, transitioning to the style it did and the presentation it did. He could have wrestled anybody on a top level and been good. Jason's a guy that stands out to me as just one of the best guys I've ever been in the ring with. Who else is on that list? Jimmy Jacobs is on that list, and I might say that with a little bit of bias because he's a good friend of mine. But he's such an underappreciated and undervalued talent. Jimmy Jacobs is just one of those guys. You put him in front of any audience, any crowd, any town, and he's going to take that moment and make that show about him in a positive way, not in a selfish, I'm stealing from others. But I remember when he was first pitched to me, it was 2010 before he first started coming up here. And he, anyone who knows Jimmy, he's not a big guy. He's a very, very small guy. And that's probably the one thing that held him back from being the bigger star than he was. But I'm like, he's really small. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good fix. We had like a lot of really big guys at the time, a lot of big heavyweights and things of that nature. I was like, I don't know if that would work. But we took a chance, if you want to call it that. We gave him an opportunity to come do one of these tours. And I got in the ring with him and I was like, oh, wow. This guy's he's on another level. And I've wrestled Jimmy Jacobs throughout my career and throughout different phases of my body being different sizes. I've wrestled him in my early 20s when I was a $190 and a junior heavyweight myself. And I've wrestled Jimmy Jacobs when I was just jacked to the gills at 270 pounds, with him being the same size throughout all of that. And what makes Jimmy so good is, for as small as he is, when you get in the ring with him, whether you're a wrestler or a fan, watching him in that match, you don't pay attention to it at all. And that you don't notice it one bit. He could be in the ring with somebody like me when I was 270 and you don't go, that guy's a little too small to be in there with that big guy. He's so believable and convincing with everything that he does. He has such great conviction, such great intensity. He knows that character inside and out that you don't doubt for a second he is who he's saying he is. And for that, I've always valued him as one of the best wrestlers I've ever been in the ring with. We could be on a tour and one night you might need him to be a baby face. The next night you might need him to be a heel, depending on where we are and how the cards fall. And he will steal the show with it each and every time. Such an incredible talent. And he's such a good mind for the business, as proven by him working for every major office in some kind of creative capacity over the last 10 years. But he's definitely one of those guys that, if right place, right time, could have been, one of those guys we talk about on a major level, because he was so talented, not only as a performer, but just his mind for the business. So I would give him as well. I feel like I can go on forever, but I should probably give some local guys here as well the rub who deserve it. AJ Sanchez is another guy for, Canadian wrestling fans, the Canadian Crusher, AJ Sanchez. He's been with CWE since its inception. He's one of those guys. He's a larger framed individual for those not familiar with AJ. And he's one of those guys, when people see him for the first time, they go, this guy's, he's a big guy. Yeah, they don't really put much stock into it because he's large. But the second that bell rings, he moves. Even now that he's a little bit older and beaten up like the rest of us, he moves in a way that should be physically incapable for a man his size. He moves better and flies through the air better than men half his age, half his size. And on top of being able to do all those things, he's such an incredible entertainer. You put him in front of any audience, kids, adults, anybody, and he's going to entertain them, and they're going to leave the show remembering AJ, regardless of who the headliner on that show was, regardless of the other talent on that show. And the other great skill about AJ, and that's probably paying him dividends now as a trainer here in Winnipeg. Even in his younger years, when he still wasn't polished and didn't have years of experience that he does now, AJ was a guy you could put in the ring, and this became like a detriment to him at times, I think, and I apologize as a booker. He's so talented. You could put him in the ring with somebody on their first day on the job, first match right out of wrestling school, and he's going to steal the show with them if you give them the opportunity to do with it. Or you could put him in the ring with, the legend that's coming in from the 80s or 90s who's, barely holding himself together, but he still wants to go. AJ will go with him, and he will make him look like he did on television 20 years ago. He's such a well-rounded performer that he can get in the ring with anybody of any experience level, any talent level, and he can perform to the highest level. So he's somebody, when we talk about guys that should have made it or just didn't get the right looks at the right time by the right people, he's on the top of that list because he's somebody that could have been making $1 million in the business if, the cards fell in the right place for him at the right time.
I love that. And it's a great list and roster that you just rattled off. And I mean, you're shouting out everybody that you've worked with or had a chance to. Now, I want to talk a little bit, in the words of Macho Man Randy Savage, you're toughy in the big time. You went to WWE a couple times, and you were an extra. You took a couple bumps up there. You had a match as well. There might be more that I'm missing there, but tell me, what is it like up there? Who were you able to meet that gave you some advice, maybe, or just like, were you in awe of them? Were you marking out? Like, I have to ask. I know you're a 22-year vet, but like, what was it like?
Everything you just mentioned, from start to finish and everything in between. I started doing extra work with them in 2010 and had been doing it up until the pandemic. So I was working with WWE multiple times a year, every year for almost a decade. So when you talk about thinking you're that close, whether I was or not, who knows? But feeling like you're, this close, they'd always call me. Whenever they're in the area, I was getting a call, and, they flew me down to do a performance center tryout, things of that nature. So like, I was very blessed, looking back, now, was, essentially now that my quote unquote prime, even though I feel like I'm a better wrestler than I've ever been in my life, mentally and physically, when you talk about your youthful prime, looking back on it, I was very blessed. I didn't quite get where I wanted to go, but I was so close that I got to experience enough of it to be able to say, hey, I got to do that. And, it's crazy just how fast the business changes. Because like, I remember the first time I did it in 2010, I would have been 21, 22 years old. And I remember being backstage and just shit myself. Like, I'm a young kid, WWE. And when you walked into that locker room or you walked into catering for the first time, there's like the Big Show and Kane and the Undertaker and the Great Khali. And there's just these monsters of human beings. And here I am as like a 180-pound kid going like, I don't belong here. You definitely felt, you felt out of place, but you fast forward almost 10 years later. And when I'm doing the extra work, I'm 270 pounds walking around the locker room or catering. I was bigger than almost everybody on the roster they had at the time. So it was interesting over a decade to see how the business changed, from these monsters and larger than life personalities to, a smaller, more, fit athlete, so to speak, if you want to call it that. But I got to experience all of that. I got to get comfortable being there and not nervous. Because obviously the first few times you're there and when you're younger, you're walking on eggshells because, this is your dream so close to becoming true and you want to get an opportunity. And, I was very lucky. I got a lot of opportunities to keep on going back. Like when this is something a lot of people, and I could be wrong. I could be speaking out of turn here, but this is how I kind of felt, over the decade I was doing it. Like when I first started going in the first part of that decade, it was still a part of their scouting system. Like you had to have somebody kind of recommend you, or you had to be kind of making some waves on the independent scene, or you had to be a good physical specimen, especially like 2010. Like, as I mentioned, just the large guys that they had there to kind of get on the radar. So when I first started doing extra work, like you were doing matches in front of the agents, whoever that may be at the time, whoever was head of talent relations, and they would give you a good evaluation. Like they would give you notes after, this is what you did right. This is what we do wrong. This is what we want to see from you next time. I remember doing 3-hour seminars in the stands before the shows with William Regal, who's kind of giving you a tutorial on what the company is and what they expect from you or want from you. So it kind of seemed like a grooming process. Like, you're here, we're interested in you, but here's what you need to know. Let's catch you up to speed and see if you catch up or not. So that was kind of my first few years experiences there, and then over time, like once NXT started, you kind of felt the shift, because they had a more formal scouting system, through their NXT program, whether it be through the internet or the independents. They were sending talent to the major independents in the US to kind of scout talent out. So there was kind of like a hard shift somewhere in the mid 2000s, around the time NXT started, where you're almost literally just kind of an extra, in the sense that you are for a movie. I've done a lot of film and movie work, like as an extra, and small level performer. And that's kind of what that felt like near the end of that. It's like, we already have our scouting system in place. We just kind of needed a warm breathing body who knows how to take a bump, as years came on. Because if you're out there and you're anybody, we already know about it. So, the local extras, it kind of changed. There wasn't necessarily like this honor to being booked as it. If you're in the system and they knew who you were, you kept getting called as long as you showed up and you know that you did what was asked. But there was definitely a shift over that 10 years of doing it. But, so many good experiences, kind of jumping back and forth here. But, like, I remember some of my early ones, like, being in my early 20s and just like literally shitting myself. I shouldn't say literally because I didn't, but, metaphorically shitting myself, doing,
Yeah.
well, I might have, who knows? But like, you do your match in front of the agents. And then I remember, like, the first time I was there, they're like, okay, now you're going to go do promos in the back. Like, they don't do any of this anymore. Not that I know of. Maybe they brought it back in the last couple of years, but they didn't in the last few years I was there. But I remember being like in my young, early 20s, and, they're okay, now that you're done your match, like, go get back in your suit, and then you're going to go do promos in the back. So you go put your suit back on, and then you get like ushered into like a custodian closet almost to do these promos. And then sitting in front of you in this room, literally no bigger than a janitor's closet, you have Steve Lombardi, the Brooklyn Brawler. You had Matt Stryker, who was one of the, the talent relation guys at the time, William Regal, and Paul Heyman, they're all in this room, 6 by 6 feet with a camera, and they're going, all right, cut a 30-second promo. And here you are, just like your eyes wide, like, oh my God, what do I say to these guys? So getting those opportunities very early, that I wasn't ready for, but helped make me ready down the road, and help, mold me and grow me as a performer, then to going back and using that advice, in the years to follow. And then, knowing that was coming and having my promo ready and having it worked out and in my mind, like, let's go, let's do this. And then getting back into that opportunity with William Regal and Steve Lombardi, nailing that promo. And this is a kind of funny story. I'll tell it shortly, but here I am. Like, I did my promo the first time, Cole's Notes version of it. I don't remember what I did in my first promo. I was there, but I remember like being nervous as shit, as anybody would be in a closet with William Regal and Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman, one of the greatest promo guys of all time. So here I am doing my promo. I'm getting my feedback. I'm probably legitimately shaking, nervous as hell. And, Paul Heyman says, that was a great promo, but that was a great wrestling promo. We don't do wrestling promos here. We're entertainment. And he kind of gave me a crash course. Like, what you did was good if this was 1988, but it's 2010, yeah. 2011. We do things a little different here. So yes, you nailed all your points, your opponent, when, where, and why. But we kind of do, I think they refer to it as a conversational promo opposed to a wrestling promo. To then going back a couple, maybe a year later, 2 years later, or whatever it may have been, and then doing the same thing with William Regal. And funny side story. So I finished my promo, and I've been thinking about this for a while because I already got the advice from the time I did before, and I'm doing my promo, and I finish it, and I'm like, oh, okay, probably did it nervously, as one would expect, confident but nervous. Finish it, sigh of relief. And then Steve Lombardi, the Brooklyn Brawler, just shits all over it, like bad. And I'm like, my heart just sank, I'm like, oh no, like I'm not getting another chance here. I'm like, what's that bad? And then William Regal, he stood up for me and he said, no, actually, he's like, everything you just said, he's like, because I referenced what William told me the time prior. And he's like, I told you to go and watch that stuff and study that stuff. He's like, I told you to do that. And I said, yes, sir. This is what you told me to say. This is how you told me to do it. And that's what I've been practicing. And he's like, I can see that. I can see that. He's like, you know what? And then he pulled me aside and, pulled me into a hall. And I thought I was being ribbed. But he said, that was great, especially to see that development and you taking that advice and that feedback. He's like, you're going to be getting a call. We're going to bring you down to Florida for a tryout. And I remember like inside, even a man, but not a grown man in my mid-20s yet, wanting to cry like, oh my God, the dream is happening. It's coming true. I'm going down to Florida for a tryout at the Performance Center, which was the coolest thing in the world. And, even looking back now, having done it, just, being a 3-year-old kid who loved pro wrestling, and all I ever wanted to do was be, a pro wrestler for WWE, just getting that opportunity, looking back now, that's special to me, so I was lucky to get that opportunity. Many great moments from that. Like I remember, I got to do a dark match with Jack Swagger. It was in Green Bay, oddly enough. That was kind of the irony of me ending up living in Green Bay, is that's where I actually had my one match for WWE. Prior to the show, we were told, oh yeah, you guys can go get dressed. We don't got nothing for you. And I don't know if I'm the only extra that's ever done this, but it's like you're watching what you eat all day in case you get called to do something. And then when they tell you you're free, you're going to be doing nothing. You're going to be sitting in the back watching the show, and that you go and you just gorge on the great catering and cheesecake and all the wonderful delights they have in the back. So here I am going, okay, I've got nothing to do tonight. I'm going to go get that cheesecake I've been waiting for. Got a big plate of cheesecake, and someone comes and taps me on the shoulder and says, hey, go get your gear on. You got a match after I'm 2 pieces in. I'm like, great. Okay, let's do this. So I got a call to do a match with Jack Swagger in Green Bay. And I wish I could see it back. You see the things from the vault now. I know I'm nobody will ever get the opportunity to pull that out, but I wish for my own memory I would be able to, because I don't remember a thing about it, just being wrapped up in the moment. But the only thing I do remember is like being, super nervous before the match, getting in the ring. And the one thing that brought me comfort in that moment was I'm standing in the ring. And at this time I'd been wrestling, for 15 years or whatever it is, or close to. And I, wrestled in front of big audiences, small audiences. I've wrestled in Japan, and just looking around and going, oh, it's a wrestling ring in a building. It's like, no, it's like everywhere else I've ever wrestled. This is no different. Don't sweat it. And then having a really good match with Jack. And I remember Arn Anderson telling me afterwards, like, you enjoy that, kid? I'm like, of course, that's a dream come true. Everybody who gets into wrestling wants to wrestle in a WWE ring in front of the WWE audience. Of course, I'm happy. He's like, well, I hope you enjoyed it, because until you get a contract here, you'll never get a match on TV. And I'm like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? He's like, at this point, I was like 270. I was just jacked up. He's like, you're bigger than half the guys that work here. They're not putting you on TV until you get a job, kid. So keep working at it. so many opportunities. And then, I got the opportunity to go down and do the Performance Center. And, this is all from my perspective, the trainers, other wrestlers there may have seen it differently, but I thought I had a great camp. I was really, really happy and confident. That was the one thing that kind of gave me closure on that chapter of my life when I was ready to move on and be a father and start building my business more permanently here at home, is knowing that I kind of laid it on the line. I gave it all I could at the time. I showed up in the best shape of my life, the best shape of my career. And, I felt I had a really strong camp, to the point where I left there going, if I don't get a job, I don't know what else I could have done. And I'm sure there's plenty of things I could have done, but at the time, that was my perspective. I was like, I killed it. I came in good conditioning. I was coachable. I had a good match. I had a really good match with Cedric Alexander that ended up, landing him a job, or at least I think was partially responsible. I'm not going to take credit for getting him his job, but I think helped contribute to that. I thought we had a really, really good match right before he got signed. And, even to the point, when I got the blanket email saying, at this time, we don't have anything for you. Just keep on doing what you're doing. Stay in touch. I reached out to Regal, who got me the opportunity. He was even surprised. He said, you had my vote, and then I don't know if he was just giving me the good brother, don't feel so bad answer, but he's like, right now with the network launching, we're focusing a lot of diverse talent from different countries and things of that nature. So he's like, just keep doing what you're doing. He's like, you did really well, just kind of stay on the radar and we'll keep looking at you. and unfortunately that wasn't the route the world was going, but he was really cool. But one funny thing that came of that I still laugh about to this day, and I do understand it if we really wanted to get in depth and detail and talk about it as a promoter and somebody who understands wrestling, I get it. But I remember the irony at the time. This was like 2017, 2018. So I was getting good praise from across the board at the trainers, at the Performance Center. And William Regal, that this is the one thing that made me for sure thought I was getting a job. I shouldn't have, counted my chickens before they hatched. But after I had my match with Cedric Alexander, we were the last match of the day. And there had been some not so good matches prior to us. There's like 40 guys there at the camp. Only like 10 of us got matches. And, some weren't so great. Some were pretty good. Me and Cedric were the last match of the day. And when we were done, William Regal said in front of all the trainers, all the evaluation staff, all the wrestlers, he said, that match right there, I would put on Raw and SmackDown tomorrow. No question. And I was like, wow, that's okay. Let's put it on Raw tomorrow then. What are we waiting for? Let's go do it. So like it was a pretty high vote of confidence that, really made me feel good leaving that, but also gave me some closure going out, get that compliment from someone the level of Regal and his integrity in the business going, okay, I did a good job. It just wasn't meant to be at this time. But I remember, hearing that, being on a cloud before I left that Performance Center thinking, all right, we made it. The journey is over and the new one has just begun. We're going to be a WWE superstar. So I'm getting, I'm saying my goodbyes. I'm thanking everybody for their time and the weekend and the opportunity. And there was a fellow by the name of Seaman Cannon, who was the talent relations guy at the time. He was the last guy that I went to say goodbye to. And it was the awkward, like, I could see he's busy, but I'm going to wait because I want to make sure that I say goodbye and not be the guy that blows off the guy that's in charge of hiring. So, I awkwardly wait for my opportunity and just say, hey, thank you very much, sir. Really appreciate the opportunity. Do you have any feedback for me, before I leave? And he kind of just brushed me off. And I don't know if it was intentional or he was just in a rush himself, but he kind of just brushed me off. He's like, yeah, kid, you're good, but you wrestle a lot like FTR. And we already have those guys. So I don't know if we have much for you. And at the time, I'm thinking like FTR was being touted as the best tag team in the world at the time. They still are in some circles. And I'm thinking, wait, I wrestle like those guys and you don't have a job for me? Like, if you feel I'm on that level, like make me Doink the Clown. I'll be I'll be whoever you want me to be. I don't need to wrestle like they do. I could do something else. But I kind of enjoyed the irony of that the years prior. Because it is true, it is a business and you need different types of characters and personalities and skill sets. But I remember just being so baffled at the time and just so crushed because I was on such a cloud. And then seeing him on the way out of the building, he's like, you wrestle like those guys, which is a great compliment, but we already have them. So I'm like, fuck. But then years after, when FTR left WWE, I got an extra, laugh on the back end of it because they did a podcast and they were talking about how, Vince wasn't so high on them. And one time either told them or told one of their agents. I don't remember exactly how the story went. But they said that, that Vince felt they felt like they wrestled too much like Arn and Tully. And to me, like that's the ultimate, compliment. Arn Anderson's one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. And he's a man him and Tully is a man I've spent hours upon hours studying tape of. So I'm like, if I'm being compared to the guys that are being compared to those guys, sure, I don't have the job, the fame, the money, but I can take some self-respect in that. And that was kind of, my story of the Performance Center.
I love that. Before I start wrapping this up, I got to ask, is the time you were up there in 2016, 2017, being extras and all that, I'm a big fan of Wyndham Rotunda. Were you able to meet him?
Yeah, I met him briefly. Never had any personal conversation. I did get to do a spot with Braun Strowman that went viral on TV. So I was close to the Wyatt family.
Between him and Roman.
Yeah, so that's my one Vince story that if you have time for me to share. As I said, all his all things aside, that is Vince McMahon now. Prior to that, I held Vince in high regard as the best wrestling personality of all time, like hands down best heel of all time. So I always loved everything about the Vince McMahon character. So here I am. This is I got two opportunities to work with Vince. Once was prior to a TLC pay-per-view in Minneapolis. Kane was working with, I think, Braun. It might have been with Braun again. But they were going to be doing like a choke slam off the stage through some tables. So they needed to make sure they had like the right camera angle. So I was the extra selected to like take choke slam after choke slam after choke slam off the stage from Kane onto the crash mat to make sure they had the right angle for later in the pay-per-view. And although I had no involvement in it at all, other than standing there and being lifted like a literal child, that's how strong Kane was. I was, 250, 260 at the time. And here we are just doing these takes. And if I wouldn't have jumped, it wouldn't have mattered. He just kept up and down, up and down, up and down. But getting to be involved in that circle with Vince, the production guys, Kane, and whoever as they're figuring out the shot. So I was like, oh, that's really cool just to be in on this as they're putting it together. But my one direct Vince story, so that spot with Roman. So I got called. This is around the time they were doing like the network stuff. So like a lot of times extras were being used for just kind of all kinds of silly backstage skits and things of that nature, whatever they were filming for the network that week. So I got called to do something, which was going to be like a backstage network skit, probably just like in catering, background jabroni kind of deal. So then I called away to do that. I come back to the extras where they're all sitting. And Jamie Noble's like talking to the extras and he goes, "Hey, are you an extra?" And they go, yeah, I am. He's like, "Hey, I need you for a spot." I'm like, raise my hand politely. Actually, they have me doing one already. I don't know if that's going to conflict. He's like, no, don't worry about it. You're doing this now. Okay. And I come to learn why. It's because I was physically the largest. And I don't mean that in a braggadocious way. I come to learn why they needed the largest person to do it, because you could have probably been killed doing it. So they needed the biggest guy they could to take the bump. But they call me aside and they say, "We're going to be doing this spot right before the main event. We're going to put you as a security guard at ringside." And essentially, for those that haven't seen the spot, Roman Reigns and Braun Strowman, they end up brawling out of the ring, around the building, throughout the people, things of that nature. So I'm in the back and they're telling me what the spot's going to be. And at the time, I had a really bad back injury. I shouldn't have disclosed that then or now, but I had a really bad back injury. And but you're just being a good brother and you're toughing it out. And you're like, we're not missing this opportunity. We're going to do this. And then they tell me, this is going to be the spot. Roman's going to line up and he's going to spear Braun through you, through the barricade, and the barricade's going to explode. And here I am going, oh my God, I'm going to die. Like literally, I'm going to die. And that's the first thing I could think. Because if you haven't been next to Braun Strowman in real life, it really puts into perspective your position in the food chain if shit were to go down for real. Like you were literally a small child next to a legitimate monster of a human being. Like there's nothing you could do to defend yourself in a fight against a man that size, unless you're a man of that size or highly trained. So here I am going, I'm dead. Like how do I take that bump safely and not get hurt? So here I am, hurt, but optimistic. All right, let's do it. We want to be on, in good graces. We want to keep getting opportunities. Let's go and do it. And, it's one of those other situations that I have to watch back because the whole moment's an actual blur. So they do the spot. Roman spears Braun through me, through the barricade, huge pop in the arena. And I don't remember much other than that, other than I'm alive. I remember laying there going, I'm not dead, which is shocking because like physically that should not have been the case. I don't know how it was possible, but I made it out unscathed other than them being two top tier professionals, just because the physics weren't in my favor with that one, with how big Braun was landing on me, going through a barrier. So at the end of Raw, when you're leaving, especially at the end of a taping, like everybody is making a mad dash to get out of the building, to beat the traffic, get to the next town. Nobody gives a shit about anything but getting out of town. But here I am, like optimistic extra. I'm like, I want to go report back to Gorilla, make sure everybody was happy with my spot, make sure everything was okay, get the thumbs up. So I'm walking back through the locker room area, and Road Dogg, who's a friend of mine who had done some very early CWE tours. He's a producer and was the producer of that segment, I believe. He says, "Hey, Danny," he's like, "great job out there." He's like, Vince told me to give you, make sure you get a bonus for that. And for anyone who knows Road Dogg, he's a ribber. And he'll pull your chain at every turn. So I'm like, yeah, okay. Yeah. Thanks, Road Dogg. Appreciate it. So, I ended up making my way back to Gorilla and to make sure everything was okay with the people that ran the segment. Yeah, he wouldn't have been the agent. Jamie Noble would have been. So go back to see the segment. And at the time, like Vince is leaving the Gorilla position and he's got like an entourage with him that leaves with him. There had to be, 6, 8 security guards, staff, writers, whoever. This giant sea of people. And I'm just eagerly like just waiting there, tell me, good dog, you did good. And Road Dogg catches up with the pile and just like, hey, is sure everything okay? And he's like, yeah, Danny, good job. And then Vince realizes who I am and that I was the person that just did that bump. And I like to retell the story, which is probably not factual, but it was like a parting of the seas of his entourage. Vince like realized it was me, that bump, and like Vince goes, yes, Danny, great bump. And he gave me like a thumbs up and he did the Vince voice. And I was like, oh my God, I just got validated by Vince McMahon. And it was like, I'm like, I can retire tomorrow and my life is complete. That's all I've ever wanted is Vince to give me a thumbs up. That's all you want as a kid getting into the wrestling business. And then true to his word, I swear to God, I was shocked. I was completely shocked. I got my check and I got a very, very nice bonus that I was not expecting or didn't think I deserved. I was expecting the money I was promised, but I was given a nice bonus, by Vince McMahon for taking that bump. So Road Dogg wasn't pulling my chain, and I was very thankful for that because as a struggling independent wrestler at the time, it was much needed, especially that good American currency.
Yeah, we know that all too well up here. Our currency sucks. I hate to put you on the spot, but I got to do this because I want to see someone do it. Can you give me a quick promo, absolutely roasting Scals?
One more time?
Can you give me a quick promo, absolutely roasting Scals?
Scals?
Scals, yes.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So Scals is my co-owner of Off the Top here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, if you could just cut a quick promo on him, that'd be great.
Scals, on Thursday night, you were getting in the ring with hotshot Danny Duggan, a 7-time CWE champion, and you were going to learn a very hard lesson, my friend. You were going to learn that Americans are tougher than you. Americans are smarter than you. Americans are better than you. But most importantly, you are going to learn that the greatest country in the world is the United States of America.
Love that. This is the part of the show where I want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure. I do want to have you on for a part 2 in season 3. I think as long as schedules allow, because you're a busy man and we've been trying to line this up for quite a while. Mainly due part to my dumbass, but go ahead now and promote everything CWE for the next few months if you want, man.
Yeah, for anyone wanting to give us a follow, we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, all that fun stuff at CWE Canada. We got a big tour kicking off the year. We got 9 events in 9 days across Ontario and then 12 events in 12 days across Central and Western Canada. It is the Rage in the Cage, the 16th anniversary tour. It is the first time the Steel Cage has ever been in Canadian Wrestling's Elite. And going to be the first time that the cage has been in a lot of these towns. So for the first time ever, the Steel Cage is coming. We'll be live and in person. The Ontario Loop is headlined by WWE star Eugene, and the Western Loop headlined by multi-time WWE Tag Team Champion Rene Dupree.
I love that. If you want to give out, I don't know how much you do on the socials on yourself, because I know you do a lot of the CWE stuff, but if you have any specific
Absolutely zero
stuff you want to. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Spotlight with Shadow. Thank you, Danny, for your time. I look forward to what CWE does in the upcoming year. It sounds like it's already starting off with a banger of an events, so I'm sure it's only going to go up from there. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, I am Shadow. This is Danny. Thank you for tuning in to another episode.
Thank you.